You're listening to Harrowsmith Radio. I'm your host, Wayne McPhail. In this episode, we learn how COVID and a fortuitous canoe trip led to an affordable housing expert and an architect buying and giving fresh purpose to a 135-year-old grist mill in Paisley, Ontario. Next, how cities and citizens can make their communities more friendly for birds, and why that makes sense for urban sustainability. So, birds and flowers all in one episode. By the way, if you want to read Harrowsmith Magazine instead of listen to it, you can subscribe to the print version online at harrowsmithmag.com. And you can find Harrowsmith Magazine on selected newsstands across Canada. But for now, settle in for the next half hour of Harrowsmith Radio. When COVID hit, Graham and Emma Cubitt wanted to get outside and away from it all. For the affordable housing expert and architect, that meant an August 2020 canoeing trip on the Saugeen and Teeswater Rivers just east of Lake Huron near the little town of Paisley, Ontario. That trip, in turn, led them to discovering the old Stark Mill, once a thriving grist mill on the Teeswater River. The mill imported grain from across Canada and delivered flour around the world through a robust railway system and the port of Owen Sound to the north. In 2002, Paul and Helen Chrysler renovated parts of the mill and opened it as Nature's Millworks, a beloved hub for artists, crafters, and tourists to Paisley. The Cubitts bought the mill from the Chryslers 2 years ago after that fateful canoe trip. Their plans for the five-storey mill and the four-storey wooden silo beside it are ambitious, as you'll hear, and they intend to be good stewards to the 30 acres of wetlands and 2 kilometers of Teeswater Riverfront they now own. Here's our conversation about a conversion that started with a canoe outing. Hey, Emma. Hey, Graham. Thanks very much for joining us. I want to start off by talking about the mill that you guys purchased. Tell me just a bit about its history, because it's really a fascinating slice of Ontario rural history.
This mill goes back to 1885, and even before that, an original mill that burned down. And it's just been standing as a part of the industrial history of Paisley and that community for over 100 years, and is now kind of like entering a new generation of use in the community after, the previous owners were able to bring it back from the brink of dereliction. So yeah, we're just so thrilled to be the new trustees looking after it.
So the mill is actually on the Teeswater River, which is one of the 2 rivers that flows into Paisley, Ontario, which is just near Lake Huron, near Port Elgin. So it was originally, until it closed down in 75, I guess, it was a flour mill, right?
That's right. It started, as Graham mentioned, there's 2 flour mills. The first one was built in 1854 by a Scottish immigrant, John Valentine. And then when it burned down, the second mill was built within 1 year in 1885. And it produced flour, like high-grade flour with various blends that were shipped all over North America and the world until the 20s. When they say they couldn't compete with the U.S. market and subsidized grain and train pricing. So they switched to grist mill, which many Ontario mills did at the time. And then it continued as a feed mill up until the 70s.
When you say it was shipped all over the world, there was a big hub of rail traffic through Paisley back then, right? Like it was getting wheat from the west, shipping it out, right?
They would bring grain in, obviously, from local farms, but also Paisley was connected to Owen Sound by the railway. Ships would bring Western grain down to Owen Sound, offload at the terminal there, ship to Paisley, and Starks had 2 silos set up, one at the railway, which could hold about 600 tons, and then an equal amount at the actual mill. And so they had a deal with the railway. Every train car of grain that they'd bring in, they'd ship out as flour. And so there was a real network of production from both the local and Western Canadian wheat. And then all of that was getting shipped out to England, Gibraltar, the Middle East, and across Canada and the U.S.
When the mill stopped producing, it got converted into sort of an art center for Paisley. Can you tell me a bit about the previous owners to you and what they did with the mill?
Yeah, sure. So there was actually a couple different owners after the production part of the mill finished, and one of the owners was looking at building a restaurant, and he had gone through flood plan analysis and working with the Conservation Authority, found that it wasn't going to work out. So he ended up not doing that development. But at the time sold a bunch of the equipment to other mills. And so it basically sat vacant during that period. In 2000, the Chryslers retired from their work in Toronto and took this on as their passion project. And not having mill experience or heritage building experience, but they put their heart and like their own physical labors into making the mill a place to live. So they moved there and insulated the walls on the first 2 floors and added plumbing for the first time, added heating for the first time besides the stove that had heated the office, brought in electricity for the first time so that they could live there, and also run like a art and craft store that sold the works of local artists and artisans. And it was a real hub. It was a very busy store up until the last week when they closed, which was just the end of 2021.
When you guys decided to buy it, that was because of COVID, right? Like you're getting outside and stuff. Graham, can you tell me a bit about how that happened? How you stumbled upon the mill via canoeing?
Yeah, so we, like everybody else, were doing socially distant outdoor things during that first summer of COVID. And so I'd borrowed a canoe from my colleague. And when we took it back in September, we were talking about the rivers we'd been on. He's like, "Oh, you didn't get on the Saugeen. That's my favorite." He's like, "Actually, there's this cute town, Paisley, it's right at the Saugeen and the Teeswater. Actually, there's a really amazing mill you guys would have loved there." And so Emma, she looks it up on her phone and it's like, "Oh gosh, look at that. It's still for sale." So that was the first time we'd really, heard of Paisley, and we'd heard of it, but we'd never been there or anything. We decided to take a drive up the next week and literally fell in love with the mill. It's just a phenomenal building. The architecture, the wood, the beams, the history of the role it played in the community and the value the community still puts on the building. And it's a stunning location, 30 acres of land in the Teeswater River. It's like a nature preserve, really, with the mill pond and everything there. And so we were like, wow, this is phenomenal. It was also a kind of a long time sort of back of our mind dream to be able to have a place where people could go away and recharge and reflect. And, I work in affordable housing, and a lot of our tenants never get a chance to get out of the city or go to somewhere beautiful. And so we've always hoped that we could have some role to play in helping people connect to nature. It wasn't easy to figure out how to buy it, given that it's in hazard land, the floodplain, and all the rest of that. But one way or another, we figured it out, and were able to actually decide to buy it, and then work out how to do so with the Chryslers, and then take over early 2021.
I want to talk about the land, but first I want to talk about the mill a bit more. Emma, you're an architect, so I would imagine that there was, as a friend of mine would say, there was a sudden rush of crap to the heart when you first, sort of started looking at the building, because it's right on water and it's really, really old. So did you look at it and say, what did we just do? Holy crap, right?
Well, I would say, being an internal optimist, I am and a lover of old buildings. I just try to kind of ignore the scariness that is an old building that we later learned was sitting on not much foundation, especially the middle columns that go all the way up to the roof. The columns were sitting on a few rocks, not much else. So some things we did have to reinforce. When we first were visiting the mill, we knew that the floors were quite sloped. And I thought that it was because that was the way that they would have a slope so that you could clean the grain away and the debris. But talking with the mill community, no, they were all normally supposed to be flat. And so that was because the middle of the building had been sinking. So we had to figure out how to jack up the middle posts about 5-6 inches and, right next to a river. So those were some of the surprises. We haven't been scared by it. And I think probably that's because of having other experience with old buildings in the past.
Graham, you mentioned building a retreat center. Tell me what else you have planned, because you've got a lot of building there. Well, there's 2 buildings. There's the mill itself, and then there's a silo building beside it, right? So what are your intentions for, or your dreams for what that's going to become?
we kind of joke about how many phases there are in the project. Is it 4, 5, 6, 10? The first phase was just to restore the residential part that the Chryslers had created, and to make it more accessible for, physically accessible and able to have like family and friends go there. But the second phase, we're well underway right now. It's converting the old art shop and gallery space into a small retreat center with accommodation. And so that has 5 ensuite bedrooms and sort of a gathering place, for larger family reunions or things like that, yoga retreats or writers retreats or things like that. And then the ground floor will be a space that maybe up to about 50 people could gather. That's only on the first 2 floors of the mill, though. So there's 3 more stories, and we're trying to figure out what to do with that. Is it going to be shorter or longer term accommodation? We know there's a huge housing shortage in the area there, so maybe we can do something like that. And then the old silo building, which is 4 stories, but right now it's like 15 wooden grain silos in there. We don't know exactly what to do with that, but we see lots of inspiration for very cool restaurants or other kinds of adaptive reuse to turn heritage buildings. The beams, the wood are so incredible. These huge timbers, full hand-hewn timbers, and just the lumber. How can we feature that as part of something that's new and needed in the communities?
So you worked with, I think, some students at Sheridan, Emma, to try to think about what to do with the silo. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So that's been a really fun partnership. Kind of a friend of a friend is the teacher at Sheridan in the architecture program. And she found the mill really fascinating. And I think there's been 3 courses now that have used the silo part of the mill as a case study for an adaptive reuse project. And they get to suggest whatever use they think is most appropriate and design it. So we're getting lots of great ideas from that.
My wife and I go to McGregor Point Provincial Park really often, and we've seen what happens when old buildings are neglected, like old farms and stuff that are now caved in or completely collapsed, or just they almost look like follies almost. They're just wreckage. So it's great that you're trying to preserve buildings like that. Are you tapped into other people who are trying to recover mills and recover old buildings in the area and around Ontario and Canada?
There's a whole community. So thanks to Facebook, there's one group called SFOOM, the Society for the Preservation of Old Mills. And they are both in the US, and also there's a Canadian chapter. So lots of kind of information sharing on that group. And there's also some other mill owners we know just right in the community that we have been connecting with, sharing ideas. And so there's a community which is really helpful.
Now, Graham, you mentioned that you're involved with affordable housing, and you also mentioned that there's a housing need in the Paisley area. Is it your intention to do something around affordable housing with part of the mill, or what are you thinking there?
We think so. Exactly how and what, we're not really sure. We know affordable housing. We know what it takes to do it. We know how to think through the complexity of the financials and the construction of affordable housing. And we know that locally, it's a top of mind conversation for everybody. Young people can't find somewhere to live. It's a huge problem for the community. Lots of folks who are retiring don't have anywhere to downsize into an accessible apartment. So those are real things that we know we could contribute solutions. Figuring out how to do that and in a financially viable way might be part of what we need to work through. But we'd love to see affordable housing become part of the mills.
So tell me a little bit about Paisley itself, because it's a really interesting small town. It's in beef country, right? And it's right near Port Elgin, Southampton. What kind of town is it, and what is the economic state of the town right now?
It's a classic Ontario small town. It's got the buildings, the 2-story, 3-story brick buildings along Main Street. It's got the 2 rivers coming together, which is a really beautiful feature. And really, the rivers define the character of the community. Like many Ontario small towns, has had ups and downs. A lot of the businesses that were there have been sort of displaced over time by bigger businesses, big box stores, online shopping, etc. But in recent years, and even through the pandemic, younger entrepreneurs starting new businesses, new restaurants. The scenery, the rivers, the restaurants, the entrepreneurialism, things are really giving a very positive sense of possibility in Paisley. most of the downtown is actually still intact and still has a lot of heritage architecture. And so that's a really important thing. And one of the other projects that's happened since we've become involved in Paisley is the old historic Paisley Inn, which was long derelict and actually had started to literally fall down. It has been torn down now with new plans to rebuild it along the same lines as what was there in the past. And so a lot of new investments happening in Paisley that really bodes well for the future.
Yeah, and Emma, you're involved in restoring the Paisley Inn, right? Or rebuilding where the Paisley Inn was, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I'm the architect for that project. The intent is to have 35 units and create just a lot more vibrancy in the downtown, and also to replicate as close as possible the original inn that was there. That building was so ingrained in the psyche of the people of the town. Everybody has a story to tell about something that happened in that building. So we wanted to keep it the same, but just make it work with today's community needs.
Cool. Now, I just want to end up by going back to the property and talking about the land, because Graham, you mentioned that it was sort of a nature preserve, and I know there's, it's home to some painted turtles and some snapping turtles, and I imagine a bunch of other wildlife. So, what are you doing to make sure that viable ecosystem stays viable?
Yeah, I mean, it is such a beautiful space. It's about 30 acres that we own. It's on both sides of the main Bruce Road 1 there. It's got the mill pond and 2 kilometers of river frontage. It's a haven for, you mentioned the turtles. You see them all the time in season. Geese, so many geese and migrating birds come through there. The songbirds in the springtime just fill the forest with chorus. It's amazing. And then the river flowing through. And so we've started to develop some walking paths, developed some, lookout areas so you can actually see the mill pond better, be able to access the water's edge for bird watching, etc. And then being able to just help people actually be able to be in nature in a way that is pretty awesome when you're so close to town. It's a 10-minute walk downtown, but you're standing in the middle of the forest, standing beside the mill pond, being surrounded by birds and wildlife. It's just such a gift.
It's a unique ecosystem because it's also, there's a large floodplain along the property. So there's fiddleheads are just coming out right now. We have ramps and just lots of plants that you might not see in a normal hike through the forest. And so we're partnering with some local organizations, environmental groups that are going to host bio blitzes so that we can get a sense for what's actually on the property in terms of the plants and the wildlife. And also we're partnering with Forest Ontario, hopefully, to plant 500 new trees along the river's edge to create a stronger riparian boundary. So we know that's important. So we're trying to improve upon what's already there and create a more healthy ecosystem.
Well, you guys are like model citizens for not only improving old buildings, but making sure that the ecosystem is preserved. So I really appreciate you sharing your adventure with us, and I wish you a ton of luck. And my wife and I are going to be up that neck of the woods this weekend, so hopefully we'll drive by and take a look at the property. And I really wish you the best of luck.
Yeah, well, thanks for your interest, and we're very excited to be a part of this adventure for sure.
Yeah, we'd love to host your the listeners to come out to the mill too. So paisleymill.ca is the website, and there you can book it for weekend retreats or just for your own family getaway.
Great, thank you very much. That was Graham and Emma Cubitt renovating their hearts out in Paisley, Ontario. Barry Coombs is a visual artist, an avid birder, and the former co-chair of bird-friendly Hamilton Burlington. Barry's been tirelessly working to make cities more sustainable for birds, which in turn contribute to urban biodiversity and sustainability. Here's our conversation about the biggest threats cities pose for our feathered friends and what we can do about it. Hey, Barry, thanks very much for joining us. I think a lot of people, sometimes when they're downtown, see a dead bird beside a building and think, geez, that's really too bad. There's a dead bird there. But it wasn't until I started reading some of the material that I really got a sense of how big the problem is. Can you sort of sketch it out for folk?
Well, birds die in an urban environment for many reasons. One of the primary reasons is collisions with buildings. For example, birds don't really understand glass, especially reflective glass and clear glass. And so it can be quite common for them to fly into it. For example, they'll see trees reflected in the glass and they'll think it's more trees. They'll hit the glass and they will almost always perish. And if they don't drop and die on the spot, they get injured, and they will usually be able to fly a short distance and hide in a bush or something like that, and usually they don't recover. Sometimes they do, but most often they don't.
And if they do fall and die, predators get them, right? So there's sort of a false illusion of, geez, there's not a whole bunch of dead birds because the predators get them.
Another example is in Toronto, at the base of the towers downtown. Gulls have learned to come into the towers early in the morning during migration and pick up and devour dead birds. There's no accurate way to record the actual number of dead birds.
So what are the counts really? Like, how many dead birds are we facing in urban environments in Canada?
The estimates range from 16 to 42 million birds killed a year.
That's unbelievable. Like, that's way, way, way more than I think most people imagine.
It is. And in the U.S., with many more urban centers, it's up to 1 billion. And that's, I think, a conservative estimate.
So what besides birds hitting windows, what other aspects of urban environments are dangerous for birds?
A big threat is the use of pesticides and contaminants. And however, the major threat to birds in North America is predation by roaming cats. Their house cats are allowed to go outdoors. There are the feral cats. In Canada, the number of birds killed by cats annually the estimates range from 100 to 350 million a year, and 38% of those are by your house cat, if you let it out for the night. In the U.S., it's 1 to 4 billion. And I just read recently in Australia where they're actively starting programs to actually cull feral cats. In Australia, they feel that 1 million birds a day are killed by cats.
Let's talk a little bit about what folks can do about that. But before we do that, I wanted to sort of touch on the aspect of our birds and sustainability. Like, what value do birds bring to a sustainable urban environment?
Well, urban and rural, I guess, could be combined. But birds do many, many beneficial things. They spread seeds, they pollinate plants, they control pests, they help reduce weeds, they scavenge, so you can call them nature's cleanup crew. They're truly the canary in the mine shaft because they're an indication of environmental hazards, because often you'll find dead birds when something is wrong with the environment, perhaps some sort of chemical pollutant. They support the economy because birding is by far the fastest growing hobby, perhaps even globally, certainly in North America. During the pandemic, there have been several studies about the benefit of birds and nature overall, but birds in particular, and on how they are good for mental health.
The other aspect that I've read about is migratory birds and lit buildings at night. Can you tell me a little bit about the danger of that?
Birds don't understand the lighting. The lighting of the buildings will confuse them and often attract them to the buildings where they're very susceptible to striking the buildings and perishing. FLAP Canada, which is the Fatal Light Awareness Program, was founded in Toronto a little over 30 years ago. And they initially responded to the dead birds littering downtown Toronto on migration mornings after hitting the high-rise buildings. But they also are very heavily involved in having bird-friendly measures adopted in architecture. And for example, right now there's a push by an NDP member of provincial parliament from Toronto to have bird-friendly measures adopted in the Ontario Building Code. Nocturnal collisions are devastating. The numbers are absolutely devastating to the bird population, but it's actually not the high towers that are the worst, as bad as they are. It's your house. Most collisions occur below treetop level, and most collisions occur in residential neighborhoods, And just windows, your third-story window might be lit up at night, and also daytime collisions. Because again, the birds during the daytime will see reflected greenery from your beautiful backyard in the window, and they will hit it. But there are things we can do about it.
So what can folks do?
At home, people can keep their cats indoors. All the veterinary associations promote healthy indoor cat living. Indoor cats live a lot longer. Outdoor cats are prone to disease, they're prone to being hit by cars, they fight with each other and so on. It's not a great environment for them, but there's a culture of the cat being this wonderful creature that is independent and allowed to roam on its own and so on. So the other thing is to treat your windows. Window treatments are little dots now. The raptor shapes of the kestrel or the hawk that we're familiar with, we've probably seen for decades now on buildings, are not that effective because they don't give the coverage that's needed. And what the better treatments now, and the biggest company making them is called Feather Friendly, which is making them internationally now. They're little dots or little tiny squares, and sometimes they're done also in attractive patterns. But the little squares or dots average about 2 inches apart from each other. And when you install those on your window, the birds perceive them as a solid shape pretty much. And also the gaps narrow enough, they won't attempt to fly through those narrow gaps. From the inside, people say, well, it's going to ruin my view. But human perception tends to block out unnecessary information. And so you will find that if you sat in a room with a big picture window treated with feather-friendly treatments, you would probably become accustomed to them quite quickly and not really notice the difference as you look out into your backyard.
Great. Thanks very much, Barry.
Thank you.
That was Barry Coombs keeping his cats indoors in Hamilton, Ontario. So, here we are at the end of this episode of Harrowsmith Radio. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing to this podcast at Apple Podcasts or in your favorite podcast player. And please tell your friends and family. Got feedback? We'd love to hear it. You can email us at letters@harrowsmithmag.com. That URL, harrowsmithmag.com, is also where you can order subscriptions online. And you can find Harrowsmith Magazine on newsstands of selected stores across Canada. Until next time, for Harrowsmith Radio, I'm Wayne McPhail. And also, until next time, remember these 4 words: make, grow, sustain, share. Tune in for the next episode of Harrowsmith Radio.